Since I released a video on the Mac Studio, I have received a few questions in the comment section, and I want to take some time to just address them before the machine comes into our hands. Let's find out together. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. Let's start our conversation with CPU. When you're configuring your Mac Studio, for instance, if you're choosing the M1 Max, whether you're choosing the one with the 24 or the 32 GPU core, it is still the same CPU. And that also applies to the M1 Ultra as well. It is still the same 20 CPU on the 48 and the 64 core GPU. So unless you have an app that can fully utilize those extra GPU in the system, it's always the best thing to do is just to save the money right now because these SoC are really powerful anyway. And if you're a photographer like myself, in general, I would say that the M1 Max with 32 GPU is probably the most that I would recommend that you upgrade to. The only exception to that would be to go to the base M1 Ultra with 48 GPU because you do get double the amount of CPU on the system. But other than that, there are really no photo apps out there that can utilize the whole 48 GPU core on the M1 Ultra just yet. In fact, in my extensive testing on the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro, the 24 GPU M1 Max and the 32 GPU version perform within a hair of each other. We're not seeing the 32 GPU version perform faster, for instance, in Capture One at all. And if you want to spend more money to get a higher spec SoC, you can, but the problem is you're just investing the money not knowing if these software developers are going to go in and optimize the code that they have for these M1 SoC or not. And truth be told, these SoC are just really powerful that you're not going to run into a problem for quite some time. So that's my conversation about CPU. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is so many people have been asking me this question because it takes a while for you to get the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro in once you place the order. I mean, the lead time is very long. You're just getting the machine now. So you're wondering, well, because of this announcement, should you return the 14 or 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro or M1 Max and get the Mac Studio? And the answer to that question is not quite as straightforward as, yes, return the laptop and get the desktop version. Ultimately, it's going to depend on your workflow and what you need. Do you work on the road a lot? Do you need the portable display? Because if you do, I can tell you right now, you should probably keep your laptop. But if you're going to be working from your home, from your office, from your studio most of the time and you need something stationary, then I think the Mac Studio is definitely going to be a better option. Although the lead time for the Mac Studio is starting to increase between 11 and 12 weeks on some configurations. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you want to enjoy the computer right away, it's not a bad idea to just keep your laptop. But if you don't mind waiting a little bit more and getting slightly more power from it, I would say that the Mac Studio is definitely going to be a good choice. But really think about your workflow. Now, I'm going to give you some anecdotal situation. For example, I have a client that works in two different geographical areas, one location for half a year, the other location for the other half a year. And this client of mine also happens to have a color accurate display in both location, printer, and everything all set up. If you're one of those scenarios, I think having a Mac Studio may be better than having a laptop because you're really going to be working from one location for a long duration of time. What you can simply do when you want to go to the other location, just pack up and take the Mac Studio with you and move to the other location. And you can continue working like you were before. It just doesn't come with the display, but it's really not that big of a deal. That's also one of the workflows that I apply when I was working at a studio and also at home for a while. So I would just end up carrying my 2013 Mac Pro between location because I need more power than what the laptop can offer at the time. So that's another scenario that you may want to think about. All right. So one of the things I also want to mention too is that if you are going to get a Mac Studio, configure the machine for what you're going to need, not just today or tomorrow, but also into the future. So if you think you may be needing more storage space into the future, then what I would do is get more SSD space. And with regards to memory, I think that 32 is a pretty good baseline. However, if you need more memory, I think 64 is definitely going to be a good one. And I know many of you are going to say like, oh, I'm a photographer, you don't really need 64. It ultimately comes down to one individual workflow. Here's the thing, if you have multiple browser open or tabs in a browser like Chrome or Safari open running at the same time, you have mail application running, you're trying to run Lightroom, you're trying to run Photoshop, you're editing video at the same time. Sometimes I do kind of doze, not all at the same time, but I have some tasks running in the background. that is something that you may want to consider in getting 64 gigabyte. And I also hear a lot of people talking about future-proofing the machine. I think that Apple has also changed the paradigm. And throughout the years, for the past decade or so, they have been slowly changing the way how we look at the machine, starting with the laptop. Most of the components on the laptop now are just non-replaceable, where if there's a problem, they have to replace the entire logic board. You can't even pull out the SSD from the laptop. They're now applying this concept slowly on their desktop machines, starting with the 2013 Mac Pro, which you can still go in and replace component, although not easy, but you can do that. Now with the Mac Studio, you're literally buying a computer that is, in a sense, an appliance. You can't really go and upgrade anything anymore. So if you add more memory now, it's not a bad idea because yes, you can kind of future-proof it a little bit. But for instance, I will tell you right now that getting the top M1 Ultra with 64-core GPU, it's not really going to future-proof your system that much. In fact, it's just going to consume more power and also cost you more money upfront. And I don't think that's something that you really want to consider. So when it comes to configuring these machines, don't think too much about the future uses because the power inside these Apple Silicon right now, majority of the software we're using, especially for photography editing from Adobe or any other company for that matter, can't really go in and utilize these SoC to its fullest potential at the moment. I have a few more thoughts and speculation for the performance for the Mac Studio with the M1 Max and comparing that to the MacBook Pro with the M1 Max SoC. My guess is that we're going to see performance that are pretty much on par with each other. Now, Apple may have gone in and tuned the M1 Max inside the desktop version in the Mac Studio to be slightly faster. We shall see when I get that computer into the studio. The other thing I want to mention is that this is definitely a BYODKM, and I'm going to put in a T at the end as well. That means bring your own display, mouse, keyboard, and trackpad if you want to use those. Now, you can certainly buy Apple keyboard that they have made and changed the color specifically for this Mac Studio. It has a Touch ID on them. I think it's really cool, but personally for me, I generally prefer the Logitech MX Master Series keyboard and also the MX Master 3 mouse. I find that ergonomic much better than the Apple mouse itself. I mean, I've been using Apple mouse for a very long time and it hurts my hand. And a few years ago, I moved over to the Logitech MX Master Series and I like their mouse a lot better because it conforms to the hand much better. You can use the Logitech Options software with the MX keyboard to create different kind of keyboard shortcuts and control without having to press all those key combinations. So for example, the function 1 or function 2 key, I can totally customize those. This is something that you can do with Apple keyboard as well, but it's not quite as straightforward. As I mentioned, Apple keyboard does have a Touch ID. However, if you have an Apple Watch, you can lock your computer with the Apple Watch and also authenticate Apple Pay purchases with the Apple Watch. So it may not be a big benefit to get a keyboard with a Touch ID for that matter. And with that being said, as I mentioned before, if you're a photographer, for most photography workflow, even working with RAW, the base Mac Studio, it's going to work just fine. Just upgrade the SSD. You can choose to upgrade the RAM and you're going to be fine. Or even if you just stick with 32 gigabytes of RAM, it will definitely work very well. Ultimately, all these really come down to your preferences and your user habits, so everyone's going to be different. Now, the other thing I also want to mention is that I would not recommend any photographer configuring the top M1 Max SoC because you're not going to gain any benefit from that because simply enough, none of the software we're using right now are really designed to garner that kind of capability. And even if they are down the road, there's going to be something better out there in the future that you can get. So those are things to keep in mind. And just one of the last thing I want to mention here is that a lot of the tests I have run, especially if you watch my Capture One and also my M1 Max benchmark, this 16-inch MacBook Pro that costs around a third of my $12,000 Mac Pro is already beating it out in so many of its tasks. Or it's coming really close to the Mac Pro that I expect, for instance, this Mac Studio to even just be an amazing performer without having to spend a ton of money on the Mac Pro. And this is really changing the paradigm and the way how we work. So I'm going to get my first Mac Studio into the studio on Friday. I'll be doing an unboxing. I'll be testing it out right away. I should have a video published by this weekend, if not early next week. So make sure you stay tuned to the channel for that. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit on the bell if you're new. And remember, in art we trust.